Is there anybody?
We need to change the whole theme of this podcast now to focus on the screws in this room.
I don't think
And I'm
Yeah.
not including us
I
three
don't
in
think
that
that's
equation. Actually, can I, on that question of disinhibition,
Yes.
so it obviously causes a few challenges, but is there some sort of counterintuitive way in which there's an element of freeing that, or you do certain things that you might otherwise not have done, and those things in the long run might actually be really good for you? Is that a thing?
I've found it quite distressing, to be honest.
Okay.
I always saw myself as really quite disconnected, and I always saw that as quite a good thing. You know, if you work in intensive care, you see a lot of difficult things, and you deal with that because that's the nature of the job. And I don't mean to say that it doesn't affect you, but you deal with it. Whereas now, my wife will tell you this, that I struggle with, like, it sounds ridiculous, I struggle with animal programs, because every single wildlife program there's ever been, young animals get slaughtered. There's always a lovely wildebeest frolicking around next to, a lion runs up and eats it. And every TikTok video I ever watched, there's some flipping elephant getting eaten by something. And when I see fields, I see cows and things. There's part of me going, "Well, you're all going to." Remember Dad's Army? You're all going to die. You're doomed. That Fraser from Dad's Army. You're doomed.
Oh, right.
That. And so I find myself intimately connected to those things, and in some ways, you're right. It's kind of helpful for writing if you let yourself tune into that. But it's also quite emotionally hard, and of course, again, it's another one of those God's punishments, because I was the one who laughed at people like that before. I was absolutely the contradiction to what I am now. And I look, my sadly, my Twitter feed says, my little saying is, I'd rather be a hypocrite than never change my mind, and I mean that because I think the accident, again, not to hark back to it because that's not what this is about. I would very much change then, and actually, it's only 6 years, and it's a long education of learning how you work and how things are, and certainly different.
Do you think it has unlocked something in a part of your mind that allows you to write more creatively or more emotionally, or emotionally tinged?
I think people
more honestly, maybe.
Yeah, I think people who know me would say that I was like that before. And my old boss, who was an amazing boss in health in WA, who let me get on with the creative things. She gave me license to go and do stuff like things like the sculptures at City Beach, which often people see and go, well, how did that come about? Well, it was because others above me let me do that. But she once said to me, how did you ever become a doctor? Because I never hear you talk about medicine. I never hear you talk about that side of it. And I think, as you said, but I also wasn't an imaginative, creative kid. I can't draw for toffee. But I did used to sit and watch, it sounds really sad, really. I used to sit and watch late night kind of science programs and quite enjoyed reading science fiction. So there was a bit of that nerd in me. But then once you tune into sport, so there's a rigid structure to it, training and stuff, and medicine, where once you get in, there's a protocol. Then actually, for want of not trying to use the word neurodivergent, that appealed to bringing some order to the chaos. And even later on, things like the riding, I realised in hindsight that actually riding a bike is remarkably narrow in what you do. You follow the wheel in front of you and you hang on. And actually doing that for 3 or 4 hours mentally is very relaxing, because you're not thinking about things. You've not got stuff going round and round. And I found that I probably went and hid. The more Ks I did, the longer I spent with my brain in neutral. Similarly, anaesthetising people, frankly, most of the time nothing happens, which is brilliant. There's no such thing as an exciting and good day in anaesthesia. If it's exciting, something's gone wrong. So largely, you sit around and try to be as facetious as you can, perhaps annoying as you can, because actually you're part of ship. You're doing okay. So now I definitely struggle with some of the more difficult things. Like, I constantly, my son's always saying to me to stop commenting on things on LinkedIn and, and the current political situations in the US and in the Middle East. I really struggle with not making a comment and actually.
Do you find you're more impulsive, a lot
Terribly.
more impulsive now? And
Yeah.
is that impulsiveness something that happens at various times of the day? Is there any rhyme or reason
I'm
to the
tired.
impulsiveness?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. If I'm tired or if I've had a drink, I mean, I don't drink very much. And I drink a little bit to kind of help me go out because I find social situations quite difficult. But then again, I probably always did that. I mean, this is the irony, when I spent a lot of time talking to psychologists because of, the post-traumatic kind of symptoms. And we used to talk a lot about, he said, well, you always say to me, you've changed. He said, the more I talk to you, I don't think you have changed. I think what has happened is the accident has uncovered you, has exposed you, because you used to hide behind medicine and hide behind, medicine is a nice little place to hide. You go to theatres, you do your job, you do it well, you go home and people go, oh, he's a doctor. But I don't know, we talked about this, I don't have anything to do with anything else. I never thought very much about what anyone else did. I never really, again, you say that about creative, your mind is relatively closed by that discipline and detail. Intensive care, you've got 25 sick patients. I think you've got to be a remarkable person to have a broad life outside that. Most anaesthetists are climbers or cyclists or swimmers, or they do sport because, again, it's relatively benign and simple. Those people who can do more than that are remarkable. I meet general practitioners who have often got all sorts of other things going on in their lives, and I just don't have room for that. Again, I think there's a certain amount of avoiding the silence. Most of us don't like it when people say, well, what are you going to do? People go, we've got to do something. And I was thinking, why? And you realise that we're all quite averse to. See, nowadays I think of doing nothing as actually resting. That doing nothing is doing something. It's deliberately doing nothing.
Well, what about as a writer? Right, you're a writer now. You've had these lives. You've been an anaesthetist since this really tragic injury. You've become a writer and a podcaster, and you've got all these other things happening. What about the silence in writing? Is that something? Is there a silence in writing, or is your mind going a million miles an hour when you sit down to share this story, I guess, and the other things that you write about?
I heard someone, a successful writer, talk about writing, and he said that he's come to learn from his own experience when he writes best, when ideas come to him. And he says that it's usually early in the morning when I walk the dog. He says, so I do that every morning. He said, there's no guarantee that a great idea will come, but I put myself in that situation as often as I can. And then I'm sure that lots of people do that. And I've learnt that I quite like that sort of stream of consciousness sometimes. And I really hate trying to get it organised. So I always said when I started writing that it could never, how can anybody possibly spend 5 years writing one book? Well, I'm through 6 years now, although I didn't start off writing a book. And the reason for that is I like the stream of consciousness, but then somebody suddenly says, well, that's not a book. You need to get it organised. And I find that incredibly difficult. So we were talking about tools before, and writers are very averse to ChatGPT because, it's so unoriginal, it's data-driven, and But for me, in the conversations I've had with it over the last year, it helps me get organised. So I tell it what I'm doing and what I'm trying to do, and it gives me a structure to that. And it also then reminds me, and I think that's because of the conversation tones we've had, it reminds me, by the way, that you're doing the creative stuff and I'm just helping you organise it. And I think that's probably true of a lot of things. I mean, if you think about it, when you and I probably did maths exams when we were younger, you weren't allowed calculators. If you tried to take a calculator, and so those were the day when people thought the calculators were disgraceful. You need to be able to do it on a piece of paper. And now we're talking about, things like ChatGPT, and to me, it's about being able to express yourself. And if ChatGPT allows you to express your ideas, then great. And I've no doubt for teachers like yourself, Sam, it must be a challenge because what is it about human beings that makes us remarkable? For me, it's the originality and the creativity. Not being able to do sums and if you want me to analyse Shakespeare, well, I'm sure the thing can do it. what do I think about the analysis? Now, that's an interesting question. It must be difficult for teachers is where to find the value. Because, in fact, our producer's gone to sleep now because he's young and doesn't really care about any of this. But the fact that you know, reading, writing, arithmetic was all we ever did, and yet, and my wife, is super creative and very artistic, she will tell you that she hated school because there seemed to be no value in that. There was no value in that whole side of it, and yet when you move out of school and go into industry or entertainment or whatever you do, it turns out the creative people are the ones with the highest value tariff to them. A bit like, you know, me finding out that intensive care is much more difficult as a patient than a doctor. It does seem a little bit ignorant to say, God, writing's difficult. And writers go, yeah, what did you think we were doing? Do you know what I mean? And so again, you know, for me, you know, the joy of the last 6 years is those, as long as you're curious. I mean, I think remaining curious and you know, not being too keen to just go back to, well, this is what I do and this is what I know, because
So obviously you're sharing your experience in this book. It's quite a sweeping.
It's one of three. So I tried.
Can you tell me first of all, what is the thrust of the book? What do you want people to get out of that book?
To begin with, I started writing just to try and explain what had happened, to try and make sense of it, I think. And it wasn't really for anyone else. It was very much a kind of, not a diary, but a sort of just, you know, when I was moved, a stream of consciousness. You kind of, I got to a point of thinking, well, I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. And I started thinking some pretty dark thoughts about, well, what's the point? And I went to see, you know, a lovely chap in Perth who's a media guy who said, well, why would you write a book? And I said, well, you know, he said, no, let me stop you. James Lush it was, who's a really lovely guy. And James said, if you can't tell me why I should read your book and what's good about it, why would I read it? He said, uncomfortable as you might be with extolling something's merits that you've produced, if you don't think it's meritorious, then why would I read it? And that kind of started me thinking, okay, so what is the value in me sharing what has happened to me? Because I don't think it's about the medicine. I don't think it's about even the medical stuff. I think those are points of interest, and particularly, you know, my experiences from both sides of this, I think, is a fairly unique one. I think it's more about coming to terms with change and coming to terms with is moving on when you've every right to say, I'm done. In other words, I think it's reasonable when people, you know, terrible things happen to people, they deal with things. It's Edith Eger who says, well, you've every right to say, that's shit, and I'm done with this. She said, but you do have a choice. And people go, well, it's easy to say. No. Edith Eger took 50 years to decide she was going to be a psychologist. She's a girl who was at Auschwitz when she was 8 years old, lost her parents on the first day she was there. She had every reason to say, I'm done with this. And yet she chose to write about it and talk about it. And don't get me wrong, I'm no Edith Eger, but I've come to believe that although I've only ever had my one head injury, I can talk about how it was for me. And I can invite other people to talk about how it was for them, and what I think that allows people to do, in the same way as if we were talking about depression or ADHD or loss or grief, is that if your experience is different to mine, that doesn't mean that you're wrong. It doesn't mean that you're somehow wrong. It just means that it's a very varied, very different experience for everybody. And I think that recognition is really important. That just because it wasn't how it was for you, for me, that doesn't make it any less valid. And that's why.
You really want to steer away from this idea there that you've got some blueprint for.
Well, funnily enough, I've now got the very beginning of the book. There's a trigger warning, kind of jokingly, that says there are no key facts to this, nor are there any lists of top tips. Because the nature of trauma, the nature of brain injury is that it's messy and uncertain. And if that's what you're hoping this book will do, it won't. But if it will, if it confirms to you that it's difficult and tricky and takes a long time, then you're right. And if you already knew that, then you don't have to read on. But if you want to hear how that's played for me, then do that. And again, I think...
And presumably that is true not just for brain injuries. This is for people with trauma of all kinds,
but not just trauma,
and not just trauma, but
hence shift happens for all of us, and the only thing that's certain is uncertainty, and I think we're all desperately uncomfortable with that, and we all desperately try to make it. Well, I know how it is, and of course it isn't, and those of us who've been forced to confront that, I think there's a lot of lessons in that, and I think. And maybe younger people know that. Maybe they're used to things shifting, the sand shifting beneath their feet all the time. But as you said, maybe schools are desperately trying to sort of say, well, this is how it is, and the kids are going, well, it isn't like that. And now you've got this old beardy git going, no, actually, it turns out it's not like that at all. And what I thought I knew, in fact, even as an expert in ICU, turns out I know almost nothing about ICU because I thought the difficult bit was ICU. It turns out that's the easy bit. It turns out 6 years of trying to make some sense of your own life and your pain and your depression and your injuries and your loss of identity, that's much more difficult than bloody ventilators and clever drugs. And whereas I studied all my life to be good at that, and it turns out that actually trying to be a good human being and listen to others, there'd be a thing, Sam. I mean, I did ICU, so I don't have to listen to the patients. Somebody did once say to me, he said, when you say things, he said, I hope not everybody knows that you're joking. So obviously, as medics, we learn to, dark humor is a way of hiding from the reality. I mean, I was very grateful. I saw Adam Kay the other night. And I didn't like Adam Kay's books. Adam Kay, for those who don't know him, is the guy who wrote This Is Gonna Hurt, which is quite a small book about a young doctor's experiences. And he's supposed to be a diary. Well, he did well to write that diary every night. But anyway, the point is that some terrible things happened, and he actually left medicine as a result of it. But he tells jokes about it. And when I saw him do stand-up, I was quite antagonistic because for me, he seems to be making a joke of it, and I didn't like that. I don't know him, but the last 5 minutes of his show, he kind of stopped. He'd done a bit of music, a bit of jokes and funny stories and all sorts. And at the end, he said, "Just to say, by the way, none of this is funny, really." He said, "But what are you going to do? Because tomorrow." It'll be the same. And I think about if you're a CEO or a teacher. I mean, teachers must, particularly if you're passionate and you love the topic, it must be so difficult when the kids are not listening, or you're going, "This is really important," and they're going, "Oh, get lost, Mr. Sterritt."
Well, and there's no shortage of dark humour in schools either among teachers and dealing with all of those things, I guess.
And I think expressing that, I think the important thing is to not express it so brutally that it makes people uncomfortable. That was my issue with Adam. I think he was so brutal. He wrote it so raw that it was hard to read. And I don't want mine to be hard to read. Some of it is difficult.
I mean, you've mentioned hope is a really important thing to you.
Yeah.
And I imagine you want that to permeate the book, not a story of...
I mean, the reality is that bad things happen, and that for some of us, there probably isn't any reason to be hopeful, but sometimes that is all that you have. I mean, so I started off trying to write a single book. To go back to your original question that we wandered off, thankfully, my wonderfully tangential way. I thought, well, I'll write about my experiences, and I couldn't express myself. I found it traumatic to write about it. In fact, there's a very fabulous writer called Sasonke Msimang who works in, she lives in Perth, and she's a fabulous writer, and she works at the Centre for Stories in Perth, and she talks about not letting people talk or reveal or perform about their traumas until they've come to terms with them, because that in itself becomes a traumatic experience. And I'm sure she wouldn't mind me saying, I spoke to her probably 8 months ago and said, I can't make this thing work. I can't. And she said, why are you writing about it? I said, well, because she said, if you're not okay, if you don't have the words for it, then just leave it. Just leave it. And so actually,
I think that's also true for, working with a psychologist, let's say, to work through trauma. Unless you're ready to talk, if you start talking about those things too early, right, you can actually do more damage, can't you? Arguably, I mean, that's contentious.
No, I don't think it is. I think we go back to what we said about your experiences of trauma, how they impact you. That it's incredibly personal, and it's a very complex mix of things. And as you said, it's good to talk. It's not always good to talk, and people are not always ready to talk. And for me, I didn't have the words. That's why I've written so much for so long. Is because I'll write it and go, oh no, that's not right. That's not right. Or that's too no. And then I show it to someone else, and they go, well, that's not funny. Go, well, nobody. Well, it's kind of funny. No, it isn't. No, that's not funny at all. Okay, so that's not funny, and so I found that if I talk too much beyond a subject, I've got no idea what I'm talking about. But no, I think you're right that and interestingly, psychologists, you have a relationship with them as well, in that, like a painkiller. I see a psychologist, and you say to me, do you know anyone good? And I go, oh, yeah, he's brilliant, she's brilliant. You go and see them, and you go, she was terrible. In other words, there's a relationship there. There's counsellors don't tell you what to do. Counsellors don't give you answers, but they offer ideas, and they listen, and they maybe temper some of the irrational things on either end of what's going on for you. But they don't provide you with a sort of like a gym sheet of go and do this and this, because that's not how counselling works. And similarly, of course, the fascinating thing is counsellors also don't take on board your story, because there's another one in an hour and then another one. So they actually allow you to perhaps look in the mirror and have a think. And I found that with editors. So I've had 5 editors.
So you're saying editors are like counsellors, are they?
Well,
in a sense?
They are, because I write stuff down and they go, what's this supposed to be? I go, well, is that what you really meant? So my wife said this about the memoir when she read the first copy. She said, is that what you really think happened? I said, well, that's how I remember it. She was rubbish. That's not what happened. I said, well, that's my bloody memoir. I'll write what I want. And again, I think with counsellors, my counsellor now that I work with, he's really direct with me. And I think his tone has changed over the 5 years, 6 years. I won't name his name because he's the same guy who when I once told him I was going to kill myself, and he said, oh, well, if you do, can you make sure you cancel the appointment, because I'll have someone else. And I kind of went, well, that's nice, isn't it? And he said to me, and I turned up 2 weeks later, and he said, oh, I'm glad. So you didn't kill yourself then? And I said, no. He said, I'm glad you didn't. He said, I didn't think you would. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, what was I supposed to do? He says, because if I have you sectioned, then that's the end of your career, and you and I are trying to get you back to working. He said, if I have you sectioned or something, then that's the end of it. And he said, I didn't. He said, you said to me, this is shit. And he said, I agree with you. He said, but you also told me that you didn't care, and I didn't believe that either. He said, I understand that's how you feel, but, and again, now we're back to what are you going to do but get on with it. So psychologists, I think, there's a relationship there. And he, nowadays, when I say things like, well, I've changed, he says, I don't think you have. And he makes me, and I had a bit of a fallout with my GP practice because I'm not always in control of my temper, and I was quite rude to one of them and upset them. And I'm still fluff stuff about. And my psychologist said, well, you need to apologise, don't you? I said, yeah, but you. He said, no, I get why you were upset, but you need to apologise, don't you? Yeah, I do. So I did. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still don't like them, but he makes me be honest about what I'm good and bad at, which I think again is a very good thing, and it's part of the journey for me is admitting, like I'm now much more open about being afraid of things, being upset, being anxious, because that's how it is. And actually, don't get me wrong, I don't want to wear a T-shirt that says, like the ADHD thing. I'm not a fan of the label, but it is a useful way of giving people a broad idea about why doesn't that guy shut up. And again, I'm not a fan of the label, but
What about? Can you tell us a little bit about Montreal?
yeah, so that was fantastic. So I was very proud of myself because it's a 24 hours of flying, and I was really quite afraid of that. Going a long way on my own, because my fear is always that. So I had a great massive poster to take with me, so it couldn't go in the hold, so I had to go in big luggage. So every time you land at an airport, you have to go and find it. The problem is if I get tired, I get quite confused. So I land in Dubai, and there's a distinct risk that I won't be able to manage. And if I'm then not able to manage, I'm also disinhibited. So there's a risk of me being in Dubai, being very stroppy and rude with someone, and being arrested. So that was the World Congress on Brain Injury in Canada. And really fantastic. Look, world-class people from around the world. Not that many patients. So I was one of very few. Quite often there are a lot of lived experience people, which I'm not a massive fan of that label. But so I went and spent a lot of time listening to lots of people, spoke to lots of people. And I actually took a poster with me, which was kind of my version of a science poster, because they have these science posters. And this was really, about PTSD and the role of writing in helping people separate the trauma of an event and the actual event itself. So by writing about it, you separate the emotion from the facts. And I did a great big kind of poster of a version of the painting Scream, which is about anxiety. And actually, I suspect because it didn't look like anyone else's poster, and it's on the website if anyone wants to see it, it was voted the best poster, which is kind of fun, And again, I used to joke, and people don't like the word narcissist. I used to joke and say I was an insightful narcissist in the sense that I do think I'm great, but I'm also aware that I think I'm great, and it may not be true. So does that? Well, maybe I'm an insecure narcissist. In other words, there's part of all of this journey is still being seen, being part of conversations, being part of. And I'm now in a different community, so I'm now part of the brain injury community. So I like being part of that.
You like being an advocate for that group of people.
Very much so, very much so. Well, it kind of gives me a sense of why, of carrying on, why survive, why go through that. Well, I think that there are lots of people who are not as fortunate as me, be it through their injuries or through all sorts of other. I'm very lucky. My wife and I are still together. I've got a family, we were insured. So all sorts of aspects of brain injury that can be catastrophic, I don't have. And sure, the loss of identity and the loss of career and all those things has been devastating for me. Nevertheless, I'm still lucky. And, I always rail when people say, oh, you're lucky. Well, not really. I mean, I would have been lucky if I'd missed the lamppost. But I'm lucky in the sense that I can walk. And yeah, I now need both shoulders replacing, and I need more neck surgery, and my hip needs replacing. But in the bigger scheme of things, it could have been worse. And so,
can I ask you this?
Yeah.
Now that you're a writer,
yeah,
could you see yourself writing in in a completely different theme setting from the stuff that you've been writing about?
Yeah.
Is your world as a writer, now that you've got a taste for it, opening up to what else do I want to write about? Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, it definitely is. In fact, I mean, there was a time when somebody suggested I want to write a bonkbuster, kind of medical romance and sex and fun. And I said, I don't mind doing that, but I'm just not writing the sex bit, because there's nothing, I cannot imagine anything more embarrassing than trying to write something erotic. So I did say to a friend, one of my editors, I said, look, if you write the grubby stuff, I'll splice it in. I'll just write sort of, John and Bob meet on the ward. And
you'll do the setup. And
then you can do the whatever, and then we'll come back to me afterwards, the ...
Oh, so a crime thriller involving an anaesthetist?
Well, I mean, look, it sounds terribly stereotypical, but I have already written. I know how that plays out. Again, because there's part of me that wants to go back to being a doctor. All of me wanted that. but there was part of me that was also quite dark, and I think that's the kind of disinhibited side of it. There was quite a lot of things, and I figured, well, what if I had gone back to work? What if I had gone back to work, and what if that person had quietly, because you see, you'd never know, Sam, because we're highly trusted, highly respected. The irony is if something happens, we tend to circle the wagons and go, well, he's a doctor, of course he didn't do anything. But actually, as we know, tragically, for examples in the past of people like Harold Shipman, if you put medical people up on a very high pedestal, unless somebody knocks them off, you would never know. So, look, I've never done it. And in fact, my editor did say, whatever you do, never write that in your own name. So maybe, through these podcasts, in the following months, we can decide on a pseudonym. So we can figure that. I mean, we'll leave that to Will because he's the younger person. But I have done it. Look, I really love writing, and I suspect that getting the memoir out of the way will be a good thing because I need to get this one done. There are 2 others I'll write, which will be about the recovery and will be about the time beyond. And this first one is actually just about who I was. So actually, the guy's in ICU for 6 days and mostly reliving the old hymns. So that actually the irony is with any luck, the story, he kind of wakes up and all of that is gone. And actually that day is effectively like a rebirth. And that's how I see it. And that'll be the end of the book. So there isn't anything about the crash. There's nothing about the fallout from the crash because I'm not sure I know how to put that in words yet. So we shall see. Look, and so I'm hoping that there'll be at least 2 others, and I write, I write blogs for things. I had the great honour of coming to Scotch and speaking to the kids a bit about the experiences, and I really enjoyed that. And I'm flattered and overjoyed to be allowed to speak. And as I said, narcissistic, big-headed, whatever you like, that works for me. And I think, as you said, if you can manage to do some good things, some useful things, whatever you do them, it doesn't matter. If you're a billionaire who gives away $100 million, I don't care if you do it for tax reasons or because it's good for you, makes you feel good. Somebody else benefits from that. And as long as I can stay true to the fact that sharing experiences, asking people, so what do you think about that? How was it for you? Then there's a value in that because a lot of these things are not discussed. Sadly, in one of the studies I'm involved with Monash University, where I'm now a researcher, it reveals the fact that 40% of brain injury patients consider self-harm, and 65% of brain injury patients' relationships fail. There's a catalogue of things that aren't well understood, and they aren't simple as sort of, we just fell out. They're much more complicated, much more nuanced than that. And again, I think, as we're seeing now with the challenges with different sporting codes having that concussions, brain injuries are not simple, and they're not just because you get up and run off. If you talk, tragically, there are lots of good examples of sportsmen who are now utterly destroyed by that, and I think that's a very difficult place for sport, for schools, for parents. Is how do we manage that? And so maybe with any luck, we might talk about that in the next podcasts, chat about those impacts and maybe talk a bit about the variation in how it affects people and how their lives go on despite that.